I didn't expect to be driving down that old dirt road in northern Maine in late October, the air already crisp and sharp with the first hints of winter, when my father called me a week earlier about spending a weekend at a cabin. He said it was his friend George's cabin, and that George wouldn't be using it that weekend. My dad painted it like a rustic getaway. Quiet, peaceful, and perfect for clearing my head. I was 29 at the time, still living in Boston, still carrying the kind of stress you can't shake off no matter how many weekends you spend away from the city. The idea of an isolated cabin in the woods sounded ideal. The drive was long, over winding country roads lined with birch and pine, their leaves yellow and orange under the weak autumn sun. I remember the silence outside the car, only broken by the occasional crow or the scrape of my tires on gravel. George's cabin was tucked back past a narrow, almost invisible path, the kind of place that made me wonder if anyone had used it in months. When I finally saw it, the cabin looked like it had grown out of the forest itself. Rough timber, moss creeping along the roof edges, and a small stone chimney that had no smoke coming from it. I parked and stepped out, my boots crunching on leaves damp with early frost. My dog, a black lab named Tucker, jumped out immediately, sniffing around as if the forest had secrets it was eager to tell him. I let him run while I pulled my bags from the trunk. The smell of wet earth and pine filled the air, mixing with a faint, sour smell I didn't immediately notice. The cabin door was unlocked, which was odd. I didn't know George, really, just through my dad, but I felt a twinge of unease. Inside, the cabin was dim. The windows had yellowed curtains, the floorboards creaked with each step, and a thin layer of dust covered most surfaces. I set my bags down and started exploring, taking in the small living room with a rusted wood stove, a couple of chairs, and a low table. In the corner, stacked neatly, were some old cans and boxes of food, but I noticed some of them had been nibbled by rodents. I tried not to think too much about it and set about getting a fire going. As the logs caught, the room filled with a faint warmth, and the shadows seemed less threatening. Tucker curled at my feet, his occasional growl breaking the silence. I unpacked my clothes and some supplies, trying to settle in, though something in the back of my mind nagged at me. It wasn't a ghostly feeling or a premonition. It was just off. The air smelled faintly wrong, metallic in a way that made my stomach twist. I decided to check the small cabin bathroom before I fully relaxed. That's when I found it. At first, I didn't recognize it. There was a shape under a blanket in the corner, partly hidden by a stack of firewood and a toppled chair. My heart jumped, and my first thought was that someone had broken in. I froze, barely breathing, and stepped closer. The blanket was thin, and as I moved, it shifted slightly. That's when I saw the edge of skin, gray and mottled, and the unmistakable stiffness of a body. My stomach dropped, and I staggered back. It was George. The shock hit me before the realization of what had happened. He was lying on the floor, slumped awkwardly, eyes half open, and I could see the dried blood around his mouth. His hands were rigid, almost clawed at his sides. The metallic smell I'd noticed earlier, it wasn't the cabin or old wood, it was him. I stumbled over to the door and tried to call my dad, but my phone had no service. I tried dialing 911, but still nothing. The cabin was too deep in the woods. Panic set in. Tucker barked once, low and cautious, then ran toward the door, scratching at it. I realized I couldn't just leave him there. I had to do something. I ran back into the kitchen area and grabbed a large, rusty kitchen knife from the drawer. It felt ridiculous, completely useless in this situation, but it was the only thing I had. I spent the next 20 minutes trying to think. The body was in a small, cramped cabin, and I had no idea how long he had been dead. The air was heavy, suffocating. I remember noticing the faint trail of blood that had dripped from the blanket to the kitchen floor, darkened and sticky. I wrapped my jacket around my nose and mouth, trying not to gag, and decided I had to get back to my car. I couldn't leave without calling the police first, but I also couldn't stay in that cabin. I grabbed my bag, threw Tucker's leash on, and carefully edged past George's body, avoiding the blood as best I could. As I opened the door, I froze for a moment. There were footprints in the wet dirt outside, not mine or Tucker's, smaller, like someone had been here recently. My heart raced. I didn't know if George had been alone or if someone else had been here. I ran to the car, throwing my bag and Tucker inside, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone, but when I finally got a signal a mile down the road, I dialed 911. I explained as clearly as I could, telling them where I was and what I had found. They said help was on the way, but that it could take time. The road was hard to reach in late fall, and I had to stay put until someone arrived. I waited in the car, Tucker pressed against me, ears flat, his usual calm demeanor replaced with nervous energy. I kept staring at the cabin through the trees, trying to understand what had happened, trying not to imagine it any other way than reality. No excuses, no fantasies. It wasn't a story you tell to scare people. It was just the kind of thing that could happen if you're isolated in the middle of nowhere, if life and death cross paths and you're caught off guard. Hours passed. The police finally arrived, their headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. They were calm but serious, taking photos, marking evidence, and eventually covering George's body with a clean sheet. One of the officers explained to me that George had likely suffered a heart attack or stroke while alone, and the injuries were probably from falling, knocking over furniture, and hitting his head. It wasn't violent crime, not really, but it was death, sudden and terrifying. They took my statement and offered to drive me back to the nearest town, which I accepted without hesitation. As I left the cabin behind, I couldn't stop looking at it through the rearview mirror, feeling a mix of sorrow, fear, and an odd, lingering relief that it had been natural causes. I thought about the tiny details, the smell, the blood, the way the body had stiffened, and how vivid they would remain in my mind, clear and unchanging. Back in the town, I stayed in a small motel trying to process what had happened. Tucker lay by my feet, calm again, sensing that the immediate danger was gone. I couldn't sleep much that night, and I kept thinking about isolation and the fine line between life and death. I realized how fragile it all was, how quickly a place that seemed peaceful and harmless could turn into something horrifying without warning. The next morning, I called my dad to tell him what had happened. He was silent for a long time before finally saying he was sorry I had to see that. He explained that George had been struggling with heart problems for years, but didn't want anyone to worry. That didn't make it easier to picture him lying alone in that cabin, cold and stiff, surrounded by the quiet woods that had seemed so inviting the day before. Eventually, the cabin was cleared, George's body removed, and the forest returned to its normal stillness, as if nothing had happened. But for me, it would never be the same. I still think about that cabin sometimes, the smell of the blood, the stiffness of his body, and the way Tucker had sensed something was wrong before I even did. The memory is etched in me, a reminder that life is fragile, isolation can be dangerous, and sometimes horror isn't about monsters. It's about reality hitting you when you least expect it. I never went back to that cabin. Couldn't. But I kept Tucker with me on every trip after that, and I stopped romanticizing isolation or empty cabins in the woods. Some places are quiet because nothing happens there. Other times, quiet means you're the only one left to witness what happens when a life ends alone. I reached that patch of dense forest just after sunset, when the sky had already turned into a dark sheet of heavy clouds and the wind carried the sharp smell of rain. My clothes were already damp from walking for hours, and every step felt heavier than the last. I was in northern Alberta, far from the nearest town, moving deeper into an area where people rarely came anymore. It was the year 1997, and I had chosen the wrong season to start this trip. I was 27 then, stubborn and sure I could handle a simple solo trek. My plan had been to explore the woods for a few days, maybe stay out there long enough to clear my head. I didn't expect the storm to roll in early. I didn't expect the silence of the woods to feel so cold. When the first drops of rain hit my face, I knew I had only a short time before the storm became impossible to ignore. I needed shelter. I had a small tarp in my pack, but I knew the rain would be too strong for it, and the wind was picking up fast. My flashlight beam cut through the dark in a thin line, hitting nothing but trunks, wet underbrush, and the shiny eyes of some small animal that darted away. The deeper I walked, the more the wind pushed against me, almost like it wanted me to turn back. But turning back wasn't an option. I didn't even know if I could make it out in time. When I found a small clearing, I decided I had no choice. I had to build a small cabin. Something basic, something that could get me through the night. I knew it wouldn't be comfortable, but I needed walls, a roof, anything that could hold back the storm. The rain thickened into sheets, hitting the ground so hard it looked like the soil was boiling. My hands were already numb as I dropped my pack and looked for logs. The forest floor was soaked, and everything I touched felt slick and heavy. I dragged fallen branches toward the clearing one by one. Some were thick enough to form the corners. Others were smaller, perfect for layering. The air felt colder with every passing minute, and the darkness grew so deep that even the beam of my flashlight seemed weaker. I worked fast, stacking the logs in a rough square, forcing them into position, using the weight of my body to wedge them against each other. My gloves were soaked through, and water dripped from my sleeves. The smell of wet wood, pine sap, and mud filled my nose. I could barely hear anything except the deep growl of thunder and the sound of rain hammering my hood. The storm hit full force before I even had the roof halfway done. The wind roared through the trees, bending the branches overhead and throwing bits of pine needles into the clearing. Every time lightning flashed, the entire forest lit up for a second, showing long, twisting shadows that seemed to move between the trees. My breath came out in white puffs, and the cold made my muscles shake, but I kept working. I didn't have a choice. I used my tarp as part of the roof, stretching it tight between the logs and layering branches and wet leaves on top to weigh it down. Rain still leaked through the gaps, but less than before. It was enough. When I finally crawled inside, I felt the dirt shift under my knees. My small cabin was barely tall enough to sit up in, just a cramped shelter of logs and dripping branches. But it felt like a lifeline. I sat with my back against the wall, breathing hard, listening to the storm slam against the world outside. The rain hit the roof with a steady, violent rhythm, some drops slipping through and hitting my face. The wind kept twisting around the cabin like it was searching for a way in. I felt the whole structure tremble whenever the gusts became too strong. I knew it could collapse if the wind got worse, but I couldn't do anything about it. All I could do was hope. As the night dragged on, I felt a strange awareness settle into me, the kind that comes when everything else is too loud and too real. I felt the cold of the wet ground seeping into my spine. I felt the thinness of the roof above me. I felt the complete isolation of the forest. No lights, no voices, no signs of anyone, just the storm and the endless dark. At some point, between two cracks of thunder, I heard something different. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't rain. It was a low, dragging sound from somewhere behind my shelter. Slow, careful, heavy. My whole body froze. I listened harder. The storm muffled everything, but the sound came again. 2 slow steps, then a pause. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe an elk, something large that was trying to move through the thick mud. But the steps felt too deliberate, too slow, almost measured. My heart thudded against my ribs so hard it felt like it might shake the whole shelter. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, my eyes staring at the dripping roof, as if that would help me understand what was outside. The steps grew closer. They stopped right behind one of the walls, the thinnest one I had made. I could hear breathing now, heavy, sharp exhales that didn't sound like any animal I had ever heard in the woods. It sounded human, not steady, not calm, more like someone trying to catch their breath after running. The temptation to grab my flashlight was strong, but I didn't move. I didn't want anything to see the light leaking through the cracks. My whole body felt like it was trying to shrink itself smaller, pressing into the wet dirt. I could feel my fingers shaking. The breathing stayed for a long moment. Then I heard the slow scrape of something, maybe a hand, dragging along the logs. One long slide, like someone was feeling the wall, checking its shape. Then another slide, then another. My stomach felt like it was twisting itself into knots. I didn't know what it was. I didn't want to know. I just stayed still, listening as the scraping moved around the cabin 1 inch at a time. The storm outside made it hard to tell how close everything really was, but every time lightning flashed, I saw thin lines of pale light through the gaps in the logs, and I knew that whatever was out there could see those flashes too. Then, finally, the steps moved away. They didn't run. They just slowly faded, one soft step at a time until the forest swallowed the sound. But even after the last step disappeared, I didn't move. I stayed in the same position for hours, barely blinking, until the storm finally began to weaken. When morning came, a faint gray light pushed through the cracks of my shelter. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle. I crawled out slowly, my legs stiff and my clothes cold against my skin. The clearing looked different in the daylight, calmer, almost peaceful. But the ground behind my cabin told another story. There were footprints, deep, clear footprints in the mud. They weren't from any animal. They were human, barefoot, long strides, a full circle around my cabin, stopping at the same spot where I heard the breathing. I followed them with my eyes as they led into the trees, disappearing into the woods as if the person had walked barefoot through the storm without any sign of struggle. I felt a tense, cold feeling settle in my stomach, but I didn't stay to think about it. I tore down the shelter, packed my gear, and left the clearing as fast as I could. I didn't look back. The forest felt too silent now, as if something was still watching. It took me nearly half the day to find my way out. When I finally reached the gravel road that led back toward town, the relief hit me so hard I almost fell to my knees. The sky was still gray, and the trees still dripped with rainwater, but everything felt open again. Everything felt safer. For years after that night, I kept thinking about those footprints. I kept thinking about the dragging steps, the breathing, the slow scrape along the walls I had built with my own hands. I never went back to that part of the woods. I never tried to camp alone during a storm again. And I never forgot the feeling I had when I stepped out of that cabin into the gray morning light. The feeling that someone had been standing right next to me in the darkness, only a thin wall of wet logs between us, watching me while I tried to survive the night. That was the clearest ending I could ever have wanted. I got out. I lived. But I learned something real that night. Sometimes the most frightening things aren't ghosts or monsters. Sometimes they're just people you never see, moving through the dark, waiting for a moment when no one else is around. And on that rainy night in 1997, someone was out there with me. I was 34 when I rented a remote cabin in northern Colorado, near the edge of the Roosevelt National Forest. It was late autumn of 2019, a cold year, and I remember the long drive up through the empty gravel road that wound between dead yellow grass and thin pines. I had taken 2 weeks off from work because I felt like I needed to reset myself. Life in the city had been squeezing at my chest. I wanted silence, cold air, and space to breathe. The cabin itself was older than I expected. It stood on a small rise surrounded by pale dirt and scattered rocks. The logs were dark from age and weather, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. A narrow porch wrapped around the front and one side. A metal chimney stuck up from the roof, covered in rust spots like old blood. Behind the cabin, the land sloped down into thick forest where the pines grew close, their branches making a sort of wall that blocked out the late afternoon sun. I had brought my dog with me, a medium-sized, brown mutt named Jasper. He had always been calm in the city, but the moment we stepped out of the truck, he lifted his nose high and froze. His tail was rigid, and his ears flicked at every distant sound. At first, I thought he was just excited by new smells, but something about the way he stared toward the tree line made me pause. The first night passed without anything strange. I lit the old wood stove, cooked simple food, and unpacked slowly. The silence around the cabin felt heavy, not peaceful. The wind outside came in long, slow breaths, like something big trying not to be heard. Jasper kept pacing near the front window, but I tried to ignore it. I told myself he was just adjusting. On the second day, I went hiking along a thin path behind the cabin. The trail wasn't official. It looked like something animals had made. The ground was covered in old brown pine needles, and each step made soft crunching sounds. I followed the slope downward for about 20 minutes before the trees thickened enough that the light grew dim. The air smelled like cold dirt and old wood. Something on the left side of the trail made Jasper stop. His body stiffened again, and his lips pulled back just enough to show the tips of his teeth. I looked around but saw nothing except trees and shadows. I kept going, but every few minutes I felt a pressure on my neck, like someone behind me was staring. I turned more than once, but no one was ever there. That evening, I sat on the porch as the sun went down. There was no traffic, no planes overhead, no voices, just the slow, dragging wind moving through the trees. As the light faded, I noticed movement at the far edge of the dirt clearing, something pale between the trunks. It was too far to see clearly. I narrowed my eyes, and it seemed to shift behind a tree. I stayed there until full darkness swallowed the forest, but the shape didn't come closer. That night, Jasper didn't sleep. I heard him pacing across the wooden floor, his nails clicking again and again. Every few minutes he stopped and stood at the door, breathing slowly but deeply. I kept waking up to the sound of him moving. Eventually, just before dawn, I gave up trying to sleep and got out of bed. My chest felt tight, like I had been holding my breath for hours. On the third day, the air was colder. Thin frost clung to the dead grass, and the sky stayed gray. I walked around the cabin to check the exterior. On the side facing the forest, I found something strange. In the thin layer of frost on the dirt, there were tracks, human footprints, bare feet, no shoes. The prints were long, narrow, and the toes dug deep into the earth like the person was walking slowly, putting weight into every step. The prints circled the cabin in an uneven line and disappeared toward the trees. I stood there staring at them until my hands felt numb. I didn't want to believe they were real, but the spacing and shape were unmistakable. I looked at Jasper, and his body was lowered, tail stiff, head pointing toward the forest like he already knew more than I did. That evening, the cold grew sharper. I kept the wood stove burning, but the cabin still felt chilled. The walls were old and thin, and the wind found every gap. I tried to distract myself by reading, but every few paragraphs my eyes drifted toward the windows. Later that night, around midnight, I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal noise. It wasn't a branch falling or wind scraping against the wall. It was slow steps circling the cabin, crunching through dead leaves and frozen dirt. I froze in my bed. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The footsteps stopped near the bedroom window, and the silence that followed felt like a weight pressing down onto my ribs. When the steps finally moved away, they did so in an unsteady rhythm, like the person or whatever it was limping or dragging one leg. The next morning, I found more prints behind the cabin, bare feet again. This time they were closer to the back door. I also found a long drag line in the dirt, as if someone had pulled something heavy or had dragged their own leg. I spent most of that day inside, listening, waiting. The forest felt wrong. Like everything inside it was holding its breath. I didn't see birds. I didn't hear squirrels. It felt like the whole area was waiting for something to happen. By late afternoon, I made up my mind that I would leave the next morning. I didn't want to drive at night through those empty roads, but I also didn't want to spend another night there. I packed most of my things and set them by the door. Just after sunset, I stepped outside to bring in a bag I had left on the porch earlier. The air was colder than before, almost freezing. The clearing around the cabin looked darker than usual. That was when I saw it again, something standing near the tree line. At first it looked like a person, tall, thin, and hunched slightly forward. The shape didn't move. It just stood there between the pines, pale and narrow. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I took one slow step backward toward the door, but the shape didn't react. I realized then that the thing wasn't facing me. Its head was turned at an unnatural angle, like it was listening to something on its right side. Then, very slowly, the head rotated until it was facing me. I couldn't see a face, but I knew its eyes were on me. I felt something electric crawl through my back. A cold rush of fear so intense it made my legs weaken. I grabbed Jasper and got inside, slamming the door. I pushed a chair under the doorknob even though I knew it wouldn't do much. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, listening. Every sound outside felt too soft or too deliberate. For hours, nothing happened. Then, somewhere around 2 in the morning, I heard the creaking sound of wood on the porch. Slow, careful weight being put on the boards. A long pause, another step, then another, each one closer to the door. Jasper growled so low it vibrated through the floor. The footsteps reached the door and stopped. I could hear breathing through the wood, not normal breathing. It was ragged and uneven, like the person had been hurt or was trying to imitate how a human breathes but didn't understand the rhythm. The sound stayed for almost 10 minutes. Then it moved away, step by slow step, crossing the porch and descending into the dirt. At dawn, I packed the truck as fast as my shaking hands allowed. I didn't look toward the trees. I didn't check for footprints. I just drove, bouncing down the rough road until the cabin was lost behind the hills. When I reached the highway miles later, the pressure finally lifted from my chest. Jasper crawled onto the seat beside me and put his head against my leg, exhausted. A week later, when I returned the keys to the small rental office in town, the woman behind the desk simply nodded, as if she already knew I wouldn't last the full 2 weeks. She didn't ask for details, and I didn't offer any. To this day, I still think about the shape in the trees. I remind myself it was just a person. Someone living out there, someone unwell, someone who moved strangely and walked barefoot in the cold. That thought keeps the fear manageable. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the world outside feels too still, I remember the sound of its breathing on the other side of the door. And I know, deep down, that whatever I saw in that forest was watching me long before I ever noticed it. And if I had stayed just one more night, I don't think I would have walked out of that cabin at all. It was the winter of 2018 when I decided to take a break from everything. Work had been relentless. My friends were busy with their own lives, and I was starting to feel the edges of isolation rubbing raw. I found a small cabin for rent online, tucked away in the Scottish Highlands near Loch Tay. The photos promised seclusion, a chance to escape the relentless grey of Edinburgh. I packed lightly, a backpack, my camera, a couple of notebooks, and made my way north by train, the landscape gradually opening from rolling hills to jagged, snow-specked mountains. The cabin was farther than I expected. After I left the train station, I drove for nearly 2 hours along narrow roads that twisted through dense pine forests. The snow had begun to settle in patches along the roadside, and the air smelled like wet earth and frost. When I finally arrived, the cabin seemed almost swallowed by the surrounding woods. It was modest, made of dark timber, with a steep roof that had accumulated a thick layer of snow. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, which gave it the illusion someone might be inside, though I knew the listing said it was empty for the week. I parked my car carefully, feeling the icy grip of the air seep into my coat, and stepped onto the thin wooden porch. The door opened with a creak that sounded louder than it should have in the stillness of the woods. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood polish and damp, a mixture that immediately made me feel both uneasy and strangely at home. There was a single room, compact but functional, small kitchenette, a fireplace, a table, a bed tucked into a corner, a few mismatched chairs, a rug that had clearly seen better days, and a window that looked out into the forest. I set down my backpack and took a deep breath, trying to convince myself this was exactly the kind of isolation I needed. The first night passed quietly enough, though the wind outside rattled the windows and the floorboards groaned under the weight of the old structure. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a faint sound, a scraping, like fingernails on wood, coming from the front of the cabin. My heart jumped, but I told myself it was just the wind, or perhaps an animal brushing against the porch. I sat up, listened for a long moment, and then fell back asleep, my nerves unwilling to fully relax. The following day, I explored the nearby woods. I had brought my camera, so I wandered down the frozen trails, capturing the light spilling through the bare branches, the occasional deer tracks frozen in the snow. Everything felt remote, like the world had shrunk to this pocket of silence. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the tree lean to my porch. Small, narrow footprints unlike any animal I had seen before. I froze. They were human. I convinced myself that the previous tenants or a local hiker had passed by, though the thought did nothing to calm me. I locked the door carefully and checked the windows. Nothing appeared out of place inside. That night, I tried to sleep, but the memory of the footprints gnawed at me. It was on the 3rd day that I saw her. I had been sitting near the window, sipping hot tea and watching the mist rise from the forest floor, when I caught movement at the edge of the trees. A woman appeared, thin, hunched slightly, her hair tangled and dark. Her clothes were long and dark as well, and she moved with a slow, deliberate gait. At first, I thought she might be a local, perhaps a farmer or a resident of a nearby village, but her movements were too unnatural, too careful, almost predatory. I ducked behind the curtain, heart hammering, and watched. She didn't acknowledge the cabin or look my way. She simply paused for a moment at the tree lean, then continued deeper into the woods. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps she was lost. Maybe she lived nearby and had reasons to wander the forest. But a knot of unease had formed in my stomach. That night, sleep refused to come. Every sound, the crack of the fire settling, the whistle of the wind, the snap of a distant branch, made me jump. I kept the front door locked, checked the windows multiple times, and sat by the fireplace with a kitchen knife across my lap. Hours passed, and the house remained silent, save for the creaking and groaning of the old timber. The 4th day was worse. I saw her again, standing just outside the clearing near the cabin. This time, she was closer, and I could see her features. Pale, almost colorless skin, dark sunken eyes that seemed to scan the trees, the ground, and occasionally the cabin. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and she rocked slightly, almost imperceptibly. There was no smile, no expression I could read, just the vacant, unsettling stare. I realized with a jolt that she had been there for some time, observing me. I tried to avoid leaving the cabin that day. My phone barely worked, but I managed to send a brief message to my parents, telling them I was fine but would check in the next day. I felt a growing paranoia, an unshakable sense that I was not alone, that the woman was waiting for me. The woods seemed too still now, the wind too controlled, the forest too quiet. Each sound, a branch breaking, a leaf scraping, set my nerves on edge. By the fifth day, I could no longer ignore her presence. I watched her from inside, careful to remain hidden, as she moved around the perimeter of the cabin. She never approached directly, never spoke, never made noise beyond the faint shuffle of her feet. She seemed patient, waiting. I felt trapped in a silent chess game, unsure if she was assessing me or simply pacing out the woods for her own reasons. That night, I couldn't sit still. I gathered supplies, a small flashlight, my camera, a couple of bottles of water, and prepared to leave at first light. I was convinced I had to get out before she realized I was leaving. Morning came, dull and gray. Snow had fallen lightly overnight, erasing footprints but leaving the landscape white and featureless. I packed quickly, heart racing with every sound outside. I opened the door slowly, intending to slip past her if she was nearby, and froze. She stood at the edge of the treeline, watching. She didn't move. I held my breath, stepped backward, and then dashed for the car, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. My hands shook as I started the engine, the noise startling in the quiet morning. She remained at the treeline, unmoving, until I disappeared down the winding road. I drove without stopping for hours, the fear and tension giving way to exhaustion. When I finally reached a small town near the A9, I stopped at a petrol station, my hands still trembling. I asked the attendant about the forested area, casually, and he told me there had been reports of a strange woman in the woods for years. Locals avoided the area, he said, and hikers often reported sightings of her near cabins. Nobody knew who she was, where she came from, or why she remained. Some thought she was mentally ill, some that she had lost her family in the remote villages and preferred isolation. No one could say for sure. He looked at me, careful not to pry, and offered me coffee before I left. I never returned to that cabin. The memory of her presence, that patient, unsettling gaze, stayed with me for months. Even now, years later, I think about that woman sometimes, and the way she could move through the woods without disturbing anything, how she could watch without reacting. It's a strange, silent fear, less about what she might do and more about the quiet certainty that she could, if she wanted to. I learned then that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. Sometimes it's just another human, patient and unpredictable, standing silently in the shadows. Even now, when I travel through remote areas, I check the treeline a little longer, listen a little closer, and remind myself that the world can hold more than the ordinary, more than the familiar. That cabin, that forest, and that woman became a warning for me, a reminder that isolation can hide more than just beauty, and that fear doesn't need a supernatural form to feel real. I spent the autumn of 2017 living alone in a small farm cabin outside a quiet town in southern Wales. I was 34 then, tired from years of city noise and feeling like my life was stuck in one long loop of buses, crowded offices, and empty weekends. When my cousin told me about an old cabin he was trying to fix up on a stretch of farmland he bought, I decided to stay there for a few weeks just to get away from everything. I didn't expect anything strange. I just wanted silence, clean air, and long mornings where I didn't have to talk to anyone. The cabin sat at the far end of a narrow dirt road that bent between tall hedges and empty fields. The fields stretched far in every direction, almost flat, with patches of dry grass and thin lines of trees at the edges. The nearest house was about a mile away, and even that place looked abandoned when I first saw it. The farm had an old barn with half its roof missing and rusted farm tools lying around like bones. The cabin itself was small, with one front window, a single door, and a roof that creaked when the wind picked up. The inside smelled like cold wood and dust, but it felt simple and safe, at least for the first few days. I settled in fast. Every morning, I woke up before sunrise. I liked stepping outside and seeing the grass covered in a thin layer of white moisture. The air always felt cold against my face. I spent time fixing the loose boards on the porch, cleaning the inside, stacking wood, and walking around the edge of the fields. Nothing felt strange at first. I barely saw any people, only tractors in the distance or a farmer on a quad bike half a field away. I liked the quiet. On the seventh night, though, the stillness changed. It was close to midnight. I was lying in bed reading by a small lamp when I heard something sharp hit the side of the cabin wall. It wasn't loud, but it was sudden and hard, like someone threw a small rock. I froze and waited, thinking maybe it was a branch snapping or something falling from the roof. Then I heard another hit, then another, each spaced a few seconds apart. The hits weren't random. They sounded deliberate. The cabin walls were thin, so each one made the wood shake slightly. I sat there, staring at the dark corner of the room, trying to decide if I should look outside. I didn't move until the sound stopped completely. When it did, I forced myself to switch off the lamp and lie still. The silence didn't calm me. It felt heavy, like the air was pushing down on me. I barely slept. The next morning, I checked the side of the cabin, but the wood looked normal. No marks, no fallen branches, nothing. The ground under the window looked like it had been stepped on, but the grass was so patchy that I wasn't sure if that meant anything. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably an animal bumping around at night. There were foxes and badgers in the area, maybe even teenagers messing around. The fields had old paths that people used to walk through years ago. The day passed quietly, but I kept thinking about the sound. Every time the wind tapped a branch against the window, my chest tightened. I tried to keep myself busy by stacking more firewood and cleaning the tools in the shed behind the cabin. When night came, I locked the door and closed the curtains, even though I knew none of that would stop anything serious. Around 1 a.m., the noise returned. This time it wasn't a sharp hit. It was a slow, dragging sound across the wall, like something rough was being pulled along the wood. The dragging moved from the back of the cabin toward the window near my bed. I felt my stomach twist because I could feel exactly where the sound was, as if someone was slowly circling the cabin and feeling along the walls. The dragging stopped directly under the window. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't even blink. The air inside the cabin felt stale and warm, while the outside sounded cold and alive. After a long minute, the dragging continued around the cabin until it faded near the porch. I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night, but I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling until the sky turned pale gray. In the morning, I walked the full perimeter again. This time, I found something. The ground beneath the window had fresh footprints. The dirt was soft from rain the night before, so I could see the shape clearly. The footprints were human, bare feet, long thin toes, deep heel marks. The steps were uneven, like the person was walking with a limp. I felt a cold rush in my chest when I saw them. Someone had been right next to the window, standing there while I was only a few feet away on the other side of the wall. I kept telling myself maybe someone was lost. Maybe someone drunk wandered from a nearby farm. Maybe someone needed help. But the footprints didn't go toward the road. They circled around the cabin, weaving in strange patterns, doubling back, stopping in random spots. It didn't look like a lost person. It looked like someone watching. I cleaned the footprints with a shovel, not because I wanted to destroy evidence, but because I didn't want to see them again. I started thinking about leaving, but part of me felt stupid. Adults didn't run away from noises outside. Adults didn't run from footprints. But the fear I felt wasn't normal. It was the kind of fear that makes you watch your own shadow as if it could break away and attack you. I stayed one more night. That was the last night I spent in that cabin. It was colder than usual. The air felt sharp on my skin, and I kept the fire going longer than normal. I didn't read or relax. I sat on the small chair facing the door, listening to every small sound outside. The fields were too quiet. No insects, no whine through the grass, just empty air. Around 3 a.m., I heard soft steps on the porch. Slow, careful. The wood creaked under the weight. I felt a heavy pressure in my chest as I stared at the door. The steps moved closer to the door, stopping right in front of it. I could hear breathing on the other side. Not loud breathing, but shallow, steady breaths, like someone was controlling it on purpose. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I felt like if I made one tiny sound, the person would try to break in. The breathing continued for about a minute, then stopped. Silence followed, deep and absolute. I counted slowly in my head until 5 minutes passed without another sound. I waited until the sky finally started to lighten outside before I even dared to stand. When I opened the door at sunrise, the porch was empty. The ground had more footprints, again bare feet, again uneven and close to the cabin. They led down the steps, across the dirt, and toward the tall grass near the far edge of the field. The grass there looked pressed down, as if someone had been crouching or lying in it for a long time. That was enough for me. I packed my bags immediately. I didn't eat breakfast, didn't clean up, didn't even fold the blankets. I loaded everything into my car with shaking hands and drove away so fast that I kicked dirt up behind me like smoke. As I drove back down the narrow road, I looked in the rearview mirror once, only once, and I saw a figure standing in the field, half hidden by the tall grass. Tall, thin, bare-chested, pale skin, not moving at all, just standing there, facing the road, like it knew I would look back. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I didn't want to know who it was, or why they had been circling the cabin, or how many nights they had been watching me before I heard anything. I drove straight back to the city and never returned to that farm again. My cousin later told me the cabin burned down in early 2018. No one was living there. No one knew how the fire started. The official report said it was probably electrical. The cabin didn't even have electricity. To me, the ending is simple and clear. I left that place the moment I knew something wasn't right. I didn't try to be brave. I didn't try to solve anything. I didn't stay long enough to learn who was outside my walls at night or why they walked around barefoot in the cold fields. I left because I knew that whatever was out there was real, human, and watching me. And humans are the scariest thing you can meet in the dark. I never went back. I never looked for answers. And I never spent another night alone on farmland again. I still remember the year 2014, mostly because it was the only time in my life I truly felt like something was going to end me. I was 32 back then, tired of the same routine, tired of working late nights, and tired of feeling like my head never shut off. When my cousin Amir told me about a small cabin he used to visit near the Idaho-Montana border, I thought it would be a good place to be alone for a while. He hadn't been there in years, but he said the cabin was still standing, hidden deep behind a narrow dirt trail that barely showed up on maps. He warned me the place was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, but I didn't think anything of it. I drove up in early October, right when the air started to feel sharp in the morning. The sky was a pale blue when I left the highway, but by the time I reached the dirt road, long clouds had started to gather. The ground was soft from rain the day before, and the road stretched ahead in uneven lines, dipping into narrow curves where the forest grew thicker. Tall trees pressed against both sides, like the forest swallowed the road long ago and left just enough space for a car to slip through. When I reached the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how lonely it looked. It was small and dark brown, its wood worn out by years of weather. Moss crawled up the sides, especially near the base, and the windows were dull and fogged, like nobody had touched them in forever. The ground around it was uneven, covered in wet leaves and small branches. Even the air felt still, as if the place had been waiting for me but wasn't sure what to do now that I had arrived. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood mixed with dust. There was a small cot against one wall, a rusty metal stove in the corner, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. A small cabinet, its door hanging slightly crooked, held a few old pans and plates. The floorboards groaned with every step I took. Even though the place was empty, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had left in a hurry a long time ago. A cold draft slipped through a thin crack under the back door, carrying the smell of damp earth. My first night wasn't bad. I unpacked slowly, placing my flashlight, pocket knife, and a few small supplies on the table. I tried to settle into the quiet, thinking the silence might finally help me rest. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized that the silence wasn't peaceful. It felt too heavy, too controlled, the kind of silence that made you notice your own heartbeat. I fell asleep late, waking up twice to the sound of the wind brushing against the cabin walls. But the third time I woke up, it wasn't the wind. The sound was harder, like something brushing against the back door. Not scratching, not tapping, more like a soft drag, as if something heavy brushed past it. I held my breath, waiting for it to happen again, but the noise faded into the wind. When morning came, I went outside and checked around the cabin. The ground was wet from dew, and I noticed a line in the mud behind the cabin, something that looked like it had been dragged across the dirt. It wasn't deep, just a shallow trail curving around toward the trees. I tried not to think too much about it, convincing myself it could have been a log pushed by the wind or an animal dragging something. I forced myself to stop staring at it, but my stomach felt tight as I walked back inside. The second night was worse. I spent most of the day gathering small branches for the stove, trying to keep myself busy. But as the sun slipped behind the trees, the forest seemed to darken faster than usual. By the time night fully settled, the cabin felt colder inside than it did outside. I lit a small fire in the stove, but the orange glow barely pushed back the darkness. I lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the fire crackle. The wind picked up again, but there was something else mixed with it. A faint sound, a dull, steady pressure against the side of the cabin, almost like someone leaning their weight into the wall from the outside. The sound was slow, spaced out, like someone shifting their body a little at a time. I tried to tell myself it was just the wood expanding from the fire's heat, but part of me knew that wasn't true. Wood doesn't make slow, dragging pressure sounds. Wood snaps or pops or creaks sharply, not like this. When the sound stopped, I felt the silence become even heavier. I didn't sleep. I stayed on the cot with my eyes open until the fire died down and the room grew colder. I waited for the sun like someone waiting for a rescue. The next morning, I walked around the cabin again. More marks, not deep footprints, just irregular dents and smudges in the wet dirt, too messy to tell if they belonged to a person or an animal. But there were more dragging lines, crossing each other, circling parts of the cabin like someone had been walking or sliding around it during the night. The hair on my arms stood up. I should have packed up right then, but something kept me there. Maybe I told myself I was imagining everything. Maybe I didn't want fear to control me, but something about the place felt wrong. and I knew it even if I refused to admit it to myself. By the third night, the uneasiness turned into something worse. The wind was stronger, rattling the windows. The darkness seemed thicker, almost like the forest pressed itself against the cabin. I lay on the cot, wrapped in my jacket, trying to stay warm. The stove fire burned out earlier that night, and I didn't feel brave enough to get up and add more wood. Sometime near midnight, I heard it again. Not brushing, not dragging. Footsteps. Slow, heavy steps circling the cabin. They weren't running or stomping. They were steady, deliberate, the kind of steps someone makes when they're looking for something and aren't in a hurry. My mouth went dry. I could hear the steps stopping near the windows, pausing long enough that I felt a deep pressure in my chest. Then they moved toward the back door, stopping again like whoever was out there was listening. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The steps circled again, sometimes faster, sometimes slower. I couldn't tell if it was one person or more than one, but I knew it wasn't an animal. The steps were too heavy, too controlled. Hours passed like that, or maybe it was just minutes, but it felt like hours. I waited, frozen, until finally the steps faded away into the forest, swallowed by the wind. I didn't sleep at all. I sat on the cot with my knife in my hand, staring at the door until the sky outside turned pale. That morning, I made the decision to leave. I packed my things quickly, not caring if I left anything behind. When I stepped outside, the ground around the cabin confirmed everything I heard. The mud showed long, deep footprints, human footprints, circling the cabin in uneven paths. Some were close to the wall, others near the trees. And there were more dragging lines, some wide, some narrow, as if something had been pulled across the ground. I didn't want to know what. I rushed to my car, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door. Before I got inside, I turned and looked at the cabin one last time. In the daylight, it looked empty and harmless again, but I knew better now. There was something out there, someone, and that person wasn't passing by. They were watching the cabin, waiting near it, moving around it at night like they knew people sometimes stayed there. As I drove away, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting someone to step onto the road behind me. But the forest stayed still, and the cabin disappeared behind the trees. When I reached the main road, the weight in my chest finally loosened, but the memory stayed sharp. Even now, years later, I still think about the dragging lines, the smudged footprints, the slow footsteps circling in the dark. I think about how someone had been walking around that cabin long before I arrived, and probably long after I left. I never went back to ask questions. I never asked my cousin if he ever heard anything strange there. I didn't want answers. All I know is that whatever was walking around the cabin that night was real, human, and far more dangerous than anything supernatural. And the scariest part was not knowing what they wanted or how long they watched me before I even realized they were there. I survived only because I left when I did, and I never stayed in an isolated cabin again. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a break from the chaos of city life and retreat to a small cabin in the remote woods of northern Vermont. I had just turned 30, and the stress of my job as a graphic designer was starting to feel like a physical weight pressing against my chest. The cabin belonged to a distant uncle, a man I barely remembered, who had passed away a few years back. He left it abandoned, and I had the opportunity to stay there for a week. No electricity, barely any cell service, and surrounded by dense pine forests. Exactly what I thought I needed. The first day was peaceful. I drove the dusty gravel road for nearly an hour, the trees closing in on either side like walls, and the only sounds were the occasional crow or rustling of small animals. The cabin was modest, wooden, weathered, and smelling faintly of old pine and damp earth. The windows were dusty, the floor creaked under my boots, and the fireplace was filled with cold ashes. I unpacked my bag, set up my small portable stove, and sat on the worn sofa, staring at the thick forest through the window. The silence was heavy, almost unnatural, but comforting in its own way. That night, after eating a simple meal and reading for a while, I went to sleep around 10. The forest was completely dark, the kind of darkness that swallows everything. I woke up suddenly around 2 in the morning. At first, I thought it was a dream, but the sound was real, soft, deliberate steps crunching on the gravel just outside the cabin. My first thought was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the steps were too heavy and methodical. I froze under the thin blanket, straining my ears. The steps stopped, and a low thud followed, like something being dropped on the wooden deck. My heart pounded in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it. But the silence that followed was worse, the kind that makes you aware of every tiny creak of the cabin settling. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping a small hatchet I had brought with me, listening to the occasional breeze moving through the trees, telling myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, the sun was barely breaking through the dense canopy, casting long, flickering shadows across the forest floor. I went outside to check the deck. My stomach sank. There were footprints, big, heavy prints, unmistakably human, leading from the edge of the woods to the cabin door. I didn't want to panic, but I felt exposed. My phone had no signal. I was completely alone except for whoever had been out there. I spent the day preparing for the possibility of needing to defend myself. I stocked the cabin with whatever I could find: a few cans of food, water, and the hatchet. I even found an old rifle in the corner, dusty and worn, but apparently functional. That night, I tried to sleep in the corner of the living room near the fireplace. The forest outside seemed quieter, almost expectant. Around midnight, I heard it again, the steps, slow, deliberate, walking around the cabin. I held my breath, gripping the rifle, listening. Then I heard a window creak. Someone was outside trying the windows. My mind raced. I thought about running, but I was trapped, surrounded by forest, no way to call for help, and whoever it was could easily chase me down. I remembered the cabin's layout. There was a back door that led to a small shed behind the cabin. The shed was locked, but I had the key in my uncle's old drawer. I slowly and quietly unlocked it, leaving the lights off, and crept toward the shed. The sound of footsteps was closer now, circling the cabin. I crouched behind the door, trying to control my breathing, listening. Then a loud bang against the cabin door made me flinch. Whoever it was, they were aggressive, testing the barriers. Hours passed like this. Every sound made me jump. I stayed crouched, barely moving, until the first hints of dawn colored the sky in gray and pink. When I finally mustered the courage to look outside, I saw a man walking slowly away from the cabin. He was tall, wore a dark hoodie, and carried a bag. He didn't notice me, or maybe he wanted to be seen, but there was something about the way he moved, confident, almost predatory. I waited, heart still racing, until he disappeared completely into the forest. The following day, I decided I couldn't just stay inside, waiting. I packed my backpack, stuffed with essentials, and went to explore the perimeter. The forest around the cabin was thick, but not impassable. I walked cautiously, keeping my senses alert. That's when I found something that made my blood run cold. An old, shallow hole partially covered with leaves, about 20 feet from the cabin. Inside, I found remnants of food wrappers, a blanket, and footprints leading away. Whoever had been outside was likely hiding nearby, maybe even planning to come back. I spent the rest of the day reinforcing the cabin, locking windows, blocking doors with furniture, and preparing traps in case the man returned. I stayed awake that night, rifle in hand, eyes glued to the forest. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again, footsteps approaching, but this time, they stopped at the edge of the trees. I didn't move. The sound lingered, like he was watching me, then slowly faded. By the third day, I realized I couldn't stay. I had to leave. I packed everything quickly, leaving nothing valuable behind except for the essentials. I decided to take the main road, which meant walking through the woods until I reached the gravel path I had driven on. I moved cautiously, every crack of a twig under my boots making me freeze. Hours later, exhausted, I finally reached the road. I was soaked in sweat, muscles aching, and trembling from adrenaline. I saw a car approaching in the distance. I waved frantically, and the car slowed. It was a local couple out for a morning drive. They offered me a ride into town. I accepted without hesitation, feeling a wave of relief wash over me as we drove away from the cabin and the forest. When I finally got to town, I called the local sheriff. They didn't have anyone missing in the area at the time, but they promised to check the cabin. A week later, they called me back. The man who had been near the cabin had been arrested for multiple break-ins in the region. He had been living in the woods, watching abandoned cabins, waiting for people to be alone. The sheriff told me that if I had stayed another night, things could have turned violent. It was terrifying, but it also taught me something about preparedness and paying attention to instincts. I had come seeking peace and solitude, but the woods had reminded me that nature is indifferent, and people can be far more dangerous than the dark. That week left scars, but also a strange sense of clarity. I learned that sometimes the scariest things are not supernatural. They are real, immediate, and entirely human. Since that summer, I haven't returned to the woods alone. I still think about that cabin, the footprints in the morning dew, and the heavy steps at night. I remember the sound of the man circling the cabin, testing the doors and windows, and the helpless fear of being completely isolated. But I also remember the relief of seeing the road, the headlights of the car, and the certainty that I had survived because I stayed alert, kept calm, and trusted my instincts. Even now, when I'm in the city and hear a noise in an alley or notice someone following too closely, my mind goes back to that cabin. It's a reminder that fear is a tool, not a weakness, and that awareness and preparation can save your life. That week in Vermont changed me. It showed me the raw reality of danger and the fragility of solitude, and I carry that lesson every day. I was 28, and I had been working as a seasonal park ranger in the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana. It was the fall of 1987, and I had been assigned to a small, isolated ranger cabin deep in the northern sector of the forest. The area was known for its dense pine stands, steep ridges, and the occasional wandering bear or mountain lion. The cabin itself was built in the 1930s, a squat log structure with a moss-covered roof, a tiny stone chimney, and a creaky wooden porch that groaned under even the lightest step. The ranger who had been stationed there before me had left detailed notes about the wildlife patterns, the trail conditions, and a cryptic warning: "Don't trust the quiet at night. It moves." When I first arrived, the air was crisp and smelled like wet earth and pine needles. The dirt road leading to the cabin was barely more than a narrow path, winding between tall trees whose trunks looked like dark sentinels. I parked my old Jeep at the edge of the clearing and unloaded my gear. A small cot, my bag of supplies, a lantern, and my rifle. I had lived in the forest before, camping and hiking alone, but there was something different about this cabin. Felt watched. The first few days were routine. I patrolled the trails, checked the traps, noted animal tracks, and maintained the cabin. There were sounds, of course, the usual ones. Owls hooting, the wind shifting through branches, the occasional snap of a twig under the weight of a deer or a coyote. But on the third night, as the wind picked up and the temperature dropped, I noticed something different. The forest seemed heavier, as if every sound was amplified. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, echoed in a way that made the hairs on my arms stand. I had a small kerosene lamp on a table, casting a dim circle of light across the room. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. That night, I was reviewing trail reports and marking observations in my notebook when I heard it. A slow, deliberate crunch of boots or something walking on the snow-crusted path leading to the cabin. I froze, heart hammering. The sound stopped near the edge of the clearing. I grabbed my rifle and quietly moved to the window, trying to see through the darkness. The moon was a thin crescent, barely illuminating the surrounding forest. I saw nothing. Nothing moved except the swaying branches. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a wandering hunter, though it was far from the nearest trail. Still, the crunching had a rhythm that didn't match an animal. The nights after that grew worse. I started hearing it almost every evening. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. Sometimes they would stop, then start again. Sometimes they seemed to come closer to the porch, stopping just beyond the reach of the lantern light. I tried leaving the door unlocked once, thinking maybe someone was lost and needed help, but the footsteps never entered. They just moved around, always outside, always watching. One morning, I went out to inspect the perimeter. The snow had melted in patches overnight, leaving mud and dirt, and I noticed footprints around the cabin. They were large, human-shaped, but I knew no one should have been there. The prints were heavy, pressed deep into the earth, and they circled the cabin twice before disappearing into the trees. I followed them as far as I could, but they vanished without a trace. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept the lantern burning and I kept my rifle close. At around 2 a.m, the footsteps started again. This time, they were paired with a low scraping sound, like someone dragging something across the forest floor. I held my breath and waited. The sound circled the cabin, slowly, deliberately, and then stopped. I caught a glimpse of movement near the tree-line, a shadow that seemed too tall, too straight, and far too deliberate to be a deer or a bear. My hands were shaking as I loaded a fresh round into my rifle. Hours passed. I stayed crouched by the window, listening. At dawn, the forest seemed calm again, but when I stepped outside, I found something that made my blood run cold. The porch steps were scratched, deep gouges in the wood as if someone had been trying to force their way inside. My heart pounded as I inspected the door. It was locked, and there were no signs of a break-in. Whoever had been there hadn't tried to enter, but they had left a clear warning. For the next week, I became hyper-aware. I patrolled more during the day, and I kept the cabin lit at night. I even rigged a few simple alarms. String tied to cans around the perimeter, small rattles to alert me if anyone approached. I was determined not to let fear overtake me. One night, the sound came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't slow or circling. It was sudden, sharp, coming straight for the cabin. I grabbed my rifle and positioned myself at the window. My pulse was deafening in my ears. The shadow appeared in the corner of my eye, moving fast, almost gliding over the uneven ground. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, and I could just make out a man. Tall, heavily built, dressed in dark layers, with a hood covering most of his face. He didn't move for a long minute. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. At first light, I decided to hike down to the main ranger station. I packed my gear, leaving a small note in the cabin log about my observations, and I started the trek down the steep trail. The forest felt different that morning, quieter, as if it were holding its breath. I kept my rifle ready, every sense alert. By the time I reached the station, I was exhausted and tense, my mind racing with possibilities. The senior ranger listened to my story, and he didn't laugh or dismiss me. He nodded solemnly, then explained that in recent months, there had been reports of a poacher working the area, someone who had been avoiding law enforcement and was known for stalking isolated cabins. The footprints, the circling, the noises, it all fit. I wasn't losing my mind. I had been cautious, and it had probably saved me from a direct encounter. The following week, a team went in with law enforcement, and they eventually tracked the poacher. He was apprehended after he tried to ambush another ranger station deeper in the forest. They found evidence linking him to multiple incidents in the Bitterroot area. It was a relief, but also unsettling to realize how close I had come to a violent confrontation. I returned to the cabin once more, escorted this time, and inspected the porch and perimeter. The gouges were still there, the footprints pressed into the earth. I realized the forest wasn't just wilderness. It was alive with danger that didn't care who you were. It was humbling and terrifying, but it also reinforced something I had always known. Survival in the wild relied on vigilance, awareness, and respect for the unknown. After that season, I requested a different assignment, one closer to the main station. I couldn't shake the memory of those nights, the sound of footsteps circling in the darkness, and the feeling of being watched, helpless in my isolated cabin. Even now, decades later, whenever I walk in a remote forest, I remember that bitter fear and the silent warning the wilderness had given me. Nothing in the woods is ever truly quiet, and danger often comes in shadows that move with patience and purpose. I remember the first time I drove up to that cabin, the tires of my old Chevy crunching against the frost-hardened dirt road that wound through the Montana woods. It was November of 1997, and I had just turned 24. I had spent most of my life in the city, but the plan had been to escape for a week, alone, just me, the cold, and the hunt. I didn't know then that the week would stretch into something I couldn't shake for months. The cabin itself was tucked at the base of a ridge, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. It had been built decades earlier, the kind of structure meant to survive harsh winters rather than impress anyone. The wooden logs were darkened and rough, the roof sagging in places, a thin layer of moss creeping along the edges. I remember noticing how quiet it was. No wind, no birds, just the occasional groan of the trees. I parked the truck on a flat patch of ground in front of the cabin, stepped out, and felt the immediate sting of cold air bite through my coat. The scent of wet pine and earth filled my lungs. Inside, the cabin was a small, cramped square with a single room and a loft. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and the remnants of old ashes and blackened logs suggested someone had used it recently, though there was no food or furniture beyond a battered wooden table, a few chairs, and a cot with a thin mattress. I set down my pack, which held my hunting rifle, some food, and my sleeping bag, and took a moment to examine the place. The air smelled of damp wood and dust, a mixture that immediately made me feel alert. I had come for deer, that was all. I unpacked slowly, checking the rifle, laying out the cartridges, making sure my knife was sharp. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken, and I noticed the faint tracks of a deer near the edge of the clearing. It was exactly what I wanted, proof the land wasn't empty. I built a small fire in the hearth, letting it grow strong enough to light the room without consuming all the oxygen. Shadows danced along the walls, and I kept glancing toward the windows, feeling the isolation settle into my chest like a stone. The first night passed quietly enough, though I woke more than once to strange creaks and thuds from the cabin's exterior. I reasoned it was just the old wood settling, maybe an animal wandering close. By dawn, the frost had thickened, painting the forest in white, and I set out along a familiar trail I had spotted the tracks on. The rifle felt heavy and reassuring against my shoulder. I spent hours moving quietly through the trees, scanning for movement, feeling the rhythm of the woods. the snap of a branch, the occasional scurrying of squirrels, the wind shifting over the ridge. On the second day, I noticed something strange. There were footprints near the edge of the clearing, not deer, not elk, but human. They were fresh, the snow not yet hardened, and they seemed to circle the cabin before disappearing back into the woods. My stomach tightened. I had assumed I would have the place entirely to myself, but now I realized I wasn't alone. I searched the perimeter carefully, moving slowly and deliberately, scanning for any signs of a person, but found nothing. The tracks stopped abruptly, as if whoever had made them knew exactly where to vanish. By the third day, I had almost accepted the presence of someone else as part of the woods. I kept my rifle close at all times, double-checked my supplies, and stayed alert. That night, while eating cold beans from a can, I noticed movement at the edge of the clearing. A shadow shifted behind the trees, a figure crouching low, not running, just watching. I froze, my fingers tightening on the rifle. I could see the outline clearly, human in shape, but there was no firelight reflecting off it. After a few tense moments, the figure retreated into the forest, disappearing completely. I slept with the rifle next to me, my body coiled with tension. The next morning, I decided to investigate further. I moved slowly, leaving small marks in the snow to track my own movements. I followed a faint trail that seemed to circle the ridge, eventually leading me to an old hunting blind partially hidden behind a grove of evergreens. Inside, I found evidence that someone had been living there recently. Empty cans, a worn blanket, a broken thermos. Whoever it was had been here for weeks, maybe longer. I realized then that I had stumbled into someone else's territory, a stranger who was just as comfortable in these woods as I was. That afternoon, as I returned to the cabin, I noticed the back door slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it. My heart hammered in my chest as I pushed the door open, stepping inside carefully. The cabin was untouched. Nothing stolen, nothing destroyed, but there was a faint smell of smoke that hadn't been there before. Someone had been in my cabin while I was out. My mind raced with scenarios. Robbery, confrontation, something worse. I stayed awake that night, checking every corner, listening to every sound, convinced I wasn't alone. By the fifth day, I decided I had to leave. The sense of unease had grown unbearable. I packed slowly, methodically, making sure nothing was left behind, glancing nervously toward the trees as shadows lengthened with the setting sun. Just as I was about to load the rifle into the truck, I heard a crackling noise from the ridge behind the cabin. I froze. Then another sound, a low grunt, the snap of branches. I turned slowly and saw a man emerge from the woods, carrying a makeshift pack, his face obscured by a wool cap and scarf. He stopped a few dozen feet away, watching me as carefully as I had watched him days before. I didn't speak. I didn't raise my weapon. I just waited, tense, measuring the distance, knowing any sudden move could escalate things. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded slightly, then turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing as suddenly as he had appeared. The relief was immediate, though it didn't erase the lingering fear. I climbed into the truck, my hands trembling as I started the engine, and drove slowly down the ridge, eyes constantly scanning the forest for any sign of him. The drive back to town was long, the road slick with frost, my thoughts heavy with what had happened. I realized the woods were full of people like him, hunters, trappers, wanderers, people who lived outside the bounds of civilization, invisible until noticed. The cabin was quiet now, abandoned again, but I carried the memory of those footprints, the shadow at the clearing, and the silent figure watching me from the ridge. When I finally reached my apartment in Missoula, I unloaded my gear, checked the rifle one last time, and made a mental note never to return to that ridge alone. I told myself it was a lesson in awareness, in respect for spaces you don't fully understand. That week in Montana stayed with me for years, not because of danger from nature, not because of ghosts, but because of the stark reality that isolation can be deceptive. You can be entirely alone and still not alone. Months later, I read a small article in the local newspaper about a man living in the woods, arrested for trespassing on private property and poaching. The description matched the figure I had seen, thin, wiry, wearing a worn coat and a wool cap. I felt a strange mix of relief and vindication, knowing that the instinct to leave had been right. The cabin remained a memory, tucked into my mind like a shadowed corner of my own past. A reminder that some places are not meant to be tamed, and some encounters are better left unspoken. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a solo trip into the forests of northern Vermont. I was 29 at the time, trying to escape the constant noise of city life in Boston. I had rented an old, beat-up Subaru and packed nothing but essentials. Some food, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a blanket, and my camera. I didn't plan on staying overnight anywhere in particular. I just wanted to hike, photograph, and maybe get a few nights under the stars. But it was a late afternoon when I stumbled upon it, and curiosity got the better of me. The cabin was hidden deep in a small valley, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Its wooden walls were gray with age, and moss had claimed most of the roof. The windows were broken, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges. At first glance, it didn't even look like it could stand the winter. Yet something about it drew me in. I don't know if it was the isolation or the history embedded in the wood, but I wanted to see it up close. I parked my car roughly 50 feet away and walked up the slope toward it, feeling the ground sink slightly under my boots from the damp earth. The forest around me was silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and a distant crow's call. I kept my camera ready, snapping shots as I approached. The air smelled of wet pine and decaying leaves. When I finally stood in front of the cabin, I could see the details more clearly. The wooden planks were warped, some splintered, nails rusted and sticking out at odd angles. The door itself was half open, creaking softly in the breeze. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell. It was thick, metallic, and sour, like rust mixed with rot. Dust hung in the air, visible in the streaks of sunlight that cut through the broken windows. Broken furniture lay scattered. A wooden table toppled on its side, a chair with one leg missing, and a mattress frame with nothing on it but damp wood and insect remnants. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I stepped carefully, testing each one before committing my full weight. I started exploring room by room. One corner had old jars, their labels faded beyond recognition, some cracked and empty, others holding dark, unidentifiable substances. In the small kitchen area, a cast iron skillet still sat over a soot-stained hearth, and a tin cup lay on the floor, dented and tarnished. In another room, I found a small stack of newspapers. The top one had a date from 1982, the headline barely legible, but it mentioned a local man who had disappeared while hunting. That made my skin prickle, but I shoved the thought aside. Places like this, abandoned for decades, are bound to carry memories, and most of them are harmless. I moved toward the back of the cabin, where the floor had begun to slope downward from years of neglect. As I stepped carefully over the boards, I heard a sound, a soft, scraping noise. I froze. My heart started beating faster, but I rationalized it. Animals, probably a raccoon or a squirrel. I even chuckled at myself. But the sound didn't come from the ceiling or walls. It came from beneath me. I knelt down and peered into a gap between the boards. At first, I saw nothing, but then my eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I caught movement. Something small darted away, leaving a faint rustle. The floorboards beneath me seemed less stable than I thought, and I decided to be more cautious. I finished exploring the cabin quickly, checking the remaining corners. I found some old clothing in a pile, faded and moth-eaten, and a small tin box filled with letters, all yellowed and brittle. I flipped one open. It was a simple note talking about hunting, trapping, and living off the land. Nothing ominous, nothing threatening, just a slice of a life long gone. By now, it was nearing dusk. The forest was starting to darken, the shadows lengthening and twisting between the trees. I decided to leave, but just as I turned, I heard it, a faint tapping. Slow, deliberate, and coming from outside the cabin. My stomach clenched. I froze, listening. The tapping continued, now accompanied by a dragging sound, like something being pulled across the dirt. I told myself it was probably an old branch swaying in the wind. I tried to shake it off, but the sounds grew louder. My camera felt heavy in my hands, and I considered leaving immediately. Before I could move, I saw it. A shadow passing the broken window at the far end of the cabin. My first instinct was to run, but the door was still partially open, and the uneven ground outside looked treacherous in the failing light. I took a slow step back, keeping my eyes on the shadow. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the floor where I had been kneeling earlier, there were scratches. Deep, irregular, claw-like marks leading toward the back wall. And in the faint light coming from the windows, I could see footprints, small and human-like, but dirty with mud and fresh. They weren't old. Panic started to rise in me, but I forced myself to think. Whoever or whatever had been here recently, I had no idea if they were still around. I knew I couldn't wait and see. I backed slowly toward the door, careful not to make noise. Then the tapping came again, closer now, followed by a low, almost inaudible thud from the roof. My heart was racing, my palms sweating, and I realized I had to get out before it was too late. I bolted. My boots slipped slightly on the wet earth outside, but I kept running, never looking back. The forest seemed endless, but I remembered my car was just down the slope. Every crack of a branch underfoot made me jump. Every gust of wind felt like it was chasing me. After what felt like forever, I finally reached my car. I threw myself inside, slammed the doors, and locked them. My hands shook as I started the engine, and I didn't stop until I reached the main road, back in the part of the forest I knew. The next morning, I went back with a friend, this time prepared. But when we returned to the cabin, it was gone. Completely gone. I mean, the structure wasn't just hidden. It was as if it had never existed. No broken boards, no moss-covered roof, no signs of the dirt path that had led me there. Just forest, dense and quiet, the ground overgrown and undisturbed. It left me shaken for months. I told myself it must have been some trick of memory, or perhaps a different, smaller abandoned shack I had confused for the cabin. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something deliberate in the tapping, the scratches, and the footprints. I've hiked that area countless times since, but I never found another trace of it. Even now, when I think about it, I remember the smell, the cold draft in that empty room, the way the sunlight fell in streaks through broken windows, and that subtle, undeniable feeling that I had almost walked into someone or something living there. And I know I was lucky, because sometimes the forest doesn't want you to leave. It was the fall of 1997 when I decided to take a break from the city and spend a few weeks alone in the mountains of West Virginia. I was 26, tired of the constant noise and pressure of my job as a surveyor, and desperate for some kind of quiet that wasn't just in my head. The cabin I rented was tucked into a thin stretch of woods near an old, overgrown graveyard that few people visited. The owner had mentioned it casually when I called to book the place, as if it were just another quaint detail, and I barely paid it any attention at the time. Now, in hindsight, I wish I had. The first night was quiet. The air was cold and damp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and decaying soil. The cabin was small but sturdy, made of rough pine logs, with a stone chimney that had long since stopped producing smoke. Inside, the floorboards creaked under every step, and the single light bulb in the center of the ceiling flickered slightly. I unpacked my gear, a few books, some canned food, my old hunting knife, and a flashlight, and tried to settle in. Outside, the trees swayed gently in the wind, brushing together in a rhythm that almost felt like a whisper. By the second day, I started exploring the area. The graveyard was only a few hundred feet from the cabin, hidden behind a tangle of oaks and brambles. I had expected neat rows of stones and perhaps a few fresh graves, but what I found was a jumble of cracked, leaning markers, some toppled entirely. Moss covered almost everything, and the inscriptions were faded almost beyond recognition. The air was heavy there, dense and almost suffocating, the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums until every small sound feels like a shout. I spent most of that afternoon wandering among the stones, taking notes and sketching a few of the more legible ones. A chill ran down my spine when I noticed that many of the graves seemed to be arranged in no particular order. Children's graves, some adults, a few larger family markers. It was all scattered haphazardly, as if whoever buried them had been in a hurry or had no regard for patterns. A thin layer of fog began to settle in, curling along the ground and wrapping around the stones. I didn't feel afraid yet, just uneasy. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The wind picked up, rattling the window frames and whistling through the gaps in the logs. Somewhere outside, a branch snapped sharply, making me jerk awake. I convinced myself it was a deer or some other animal, but the sound lingered in my mind, repeating with every creak of the cabin. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something else. A faint scraping noise, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the graveyard. My first instinct was to ignore it, to tell myself it was probably the wind moving something against a tree. But then it stopped. Silence fell for a few seconds, and then the sound returned, this time a little closer, scraping along stone. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The beam cut through the darkness, slicing across the fog outside. Everything looked normal, or as normal as an overgrown graveyard can look at night, but the scraping noise had stopped again. I told myself I was imagining it, that fear was playing tricks on me. I went back to bed and tried to force sleep, but I didn't close my eyes fully. Over the next few days, the unease grew. I would wake to the faint smell of soil being disturbed, even though no one was supposed to be around. Sometimes I thought I saw movement among the trees at the edge of the graveyard, but every time I got close, there was nothing. The quiet was oppressive, and the isolation made every little sound louder than it should have been. It was on the 4th night that I realized it wasn't just the wind or animals making the noises. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day of sketching the grave markers and walking through the woods. Around midnight, I heard it again, the slow, deliberate scraping. This time, it wasn't coming from the edge of the graveyard. It was coming from right outside the cabin. My stomach dropped. I froze in bed, straining to hear anything else. The scraping stopped for a moment, then started again, circling the cabin slowly. The sound wasn't random. It moved, almost methodically, around the cabin. My flashlight was on the table across the room, and I debated getting it. Part of me wanted to see, but another part of me was terrified of what I might find. The scraping grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the window. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the blanket. Finally, I forced myself to reach for the flashlight and throw it toward the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing at first. Then I saw it, imprints in the dirt, shallow but unmistakable. Someone or something had been walking in a circle around the cabin, leaving footprints pressed into the wet soil. My pulse raced as I traced them with the light. There was no pattern to them other than the circle. Whoever had done this hadn't tried to hide, but the prints ended abruptly at the edge of the porch, as if whoever made them had vanished into the shadows. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed awake, sitting against the wall with my knife in hand, listening. Every sound of the wind or a falling branch made me flinch. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I grabbed my pack and decided I couldn't stay. I didn't know who or what had been circling the cabin, and I wasn't willing to find out. As I packed, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. One of the toppled gravestones in the graveyard had been moved. It was closer to the cabin than it should have been, as if someone had dragged it across the dirt. My stomach sank. I didn't know whether the footprints outside and the moved stone were related, but it didn't matter. I shoved everything into my car and drove off the mountain, not looking back. It took me years to understand what had happened that week. I didn't encounter anyone else in the area, and I never saw signs of human activity besides the moved stone and the footprints. I came to accept that it might have been a trespasser or a homeless person living in the woods. What mattered was the lesson I carried. The isolation of a place like that can magnify fear in a way that nothing else can. The graveyard and the cabin were just objects, but in the dark, with the fog rolling through the stones and the wind rattling the walls, they became something much bigger, a pressure that made your mind play tricks on you. I returned to the city and focused on work again, but I never forgot that week. Years later, I went back once, cautiously, during the day. The cabin was abandoned, the windows broken, and the graveyard still overgrown. I walked through the stones, noting that some had shifted again, likely moved by animals or erosion. No footprints circled the cabin this time, and the scraping noises were gone. I realized I had survived not because of luck, but because I had trusted my instincts and left. The memory of those nights stayed with me, though a reminder of how fragile normalcy can feel when you're alone in a place that holds the weight of so many past lives. There was no supernatural force, no ghosts, no magic, just the very real fear of the unknown, amplified by isolation and the sense that someone or something had been watching. And that, I think, is scarier than anything imagined. It was the summer of 1998 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was 27, exhausted from the city, from the endless noise of traffic, people, and deadlines that never seemed to end. My little sister, Claire, had given me a lead on this old cabin in northern Minnesota, tucked deep in the woods near a lake that didn't appear on most maps. She said it was owned by an old acquaintance of hers, someone who barely visited anymore. The idea of being completely alone for a week, with nothing but trees, water, and silence, sounded like heaven. My dog, Baxter, a golden retriever with a soft coat and a keen nose, was coming with me. He had been my constant companion for years, and I knew I wouldn't feel completely at ease without him. I drove for hours on narrow, winding roads, past fields of corn and stretches of pine forest so thick the sunlight barely touched the ground. The last 20 miles were on dirt roads, bumpy and overgrown, with branches scraping the sides of my car. I arrived at dusk. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, its wooden frame worn but intact, with a rusted metal roof and a thin wisp of smoke curling from the chimney. The air smelled of damp pine and something else, something earthy, almost decaying, like the woods had been storing secrets for decades. Baxter bounded out of the car as soon as I opened the door, sniffing and circling the cabin with obvious excitement. The inside smelled musty, like old wood and something that had been closed up for months. Dust covered the furniture, and the small fireplace had ashes still cold from the last fire. I set down my bags and lit a lantern, trying to shake off the unease that started to creep into the edges of my mind. There was a small kitchen with a sink, a few cupboards, and a well-worn table. A narrow hallway led to 2 bedrooms, 1 small bathroom, and a tiny loft above, accessible by a rickety ladder. I unpacked slowly, methodically, and tried to convince myself that everything was normal. Baxter lay down in the corner, his ears twitching at every creak and whistle the old cabin made as the wind blew through the pines. Night fell fast in the woods, and the darkness outside the windows was absolute. No streetlights, no passing cars, just the sound of the wind and the occasional crack of a branch. I made a fire in the fireplace, stacked enough wood to last the night, and sat in an old armchair, sipping a can of beer. That's when I noticed it. A faint smell that didn't belong. It was stronger than the old cabin smell. Something metallic and sharp, like blood, but faint. I stood, sniffed the air, but it was gone. Maybe I was imagining it. Baxter growled low in his throat, his fur on his back rising slightly. I reached for my flashlight and walked around the cabin, checking the corners and the loft, but found nothing. Still, the unease stayed, tightening around me like a physical weight. The first night was restless. Every snap of a branch outside made me tense, and every rustle of leaves felt like someone moving in the shadows. I slept fitfully, waking often to Baxter's low growl or the occasional thump against the wall, maybe an animal on the roof. I kept telling myself that I had been in the woods before, that the sounds were normal. But this time felt different, heavier, more deliberate. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. There was a small lake just beyond the clearing, water dark and still, reflecting the sky like glass. I walked along the edge, Baxter paddling in and out of the shallow water, sniffing the trees. There were tracks in the mud, some animal, maybe deer or raccoon, but mixed in with them were others, larger, heavier, not quite human but not entirely animal either. My heart thumped as I crouched to examine them. They were too deep to be mine, too irregular to be from any animal I knew. I shook it off. Probably fallen branches. Probably my imagination. By the second night, the feeling of being watched had intensified. Every time I stepped outside or looked out the window, I felt eyes on me, hidden somewhere in the dense pine. I found myself keeping the fire going all night, not sleeping in the loft because it felt too exposed. Baxter refused to go near the back of the cabin. He would circle the front and whine whenever I went near the rear woods. That night, I heard something unmistakable, a slow, deliberate footstep on the porch. I froze, heart racing. It was heavy, not human in gait, yet not animal. I grabbed an old hunting rifle from the corner. I wasn't a hunter, but I had always kept it for emergencies, and tiptoed to the door. Nothing. No one. Just the wind, I told myself. Just the wind. The third day, I decided to check the nearby trail. I wanted to see if anyone was in the area, maybe another cabin, maybe someone who could explain the tracks. The trail was overgrown, barely passable, leading deeper into the forest. I followed it for nearly an hour, the feeling of eyes on me growing stronger with every step. That's when I found it. Not a person, not a wild animal, but a body, half hidden under a fallen tree, twisted and broken, eyes staring blankly at the sky. I stumbled back, heart hammering, Baxter barking and lunging forward. The body was dressed in old clothes, maybe 20 years old, the skin pale and stiff from exposure. A small trail of blood, long dried, led into the woods. It was a man, by the looks of him, maybe in his 40s. I ran back to the cabin, adrenaline fueling my every step. I locked the doors, loaded the rifle, and tried to make sense of it. The body wasn't recent, but the way it was positioned, the tracks in the mud, and the sense of being watched, it all pointed to someone else being out there. Someone who might still be moving around these woods. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire roaring and stayed awake, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness. Hours passed. Just as dawn began to lighten the sky, I heard it again, the slow, deliberate footstep, this time on the roof. My stomach dropped. Someone had been in the cabin or had stayed near it, waiting. I didn't dare check. I packed my bags as quietly as I could, tossing in the essentials, and kept Baxter close. By mid-morning, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I had to leave. I drove back on the dirt roads, my hands white around the steering wheel, eyes constantly scanning the tree-line. I didn't stop until I reached the first highway, where traffic and civilization felt like a protective barrier. I called the local authorities, reporting the body and the tracks. They took it seriously, sent a team out to investigate, and later confirmed that the body had been there for decades, someone who had disappeared years ago while hiking, and that the cabin was on land previously known for illegal trapping and smuggling. The tracks I had seen were likely from hunters or trespassers still using the woods illegally. It took me weeks to stop checking the shadows when I was alone at home. Even now, decades later, I remember the smell of the old cabin, the cold look of that long-dead man, and the way Baxter would growl at invisible threats. I never went back, never stayed in a cabin in the deep woods again. That summer taught me that isolation can be dangerous, not because of the supernatural, but because people and even nature can hide secrets that are better left undiscovered. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to escape the noise of the city. I was 28, exhausted from the endless fluorescent lights of office buildings and the hum of traffic that never really stopped. My dog, a large German Shepherd mix named Max, had been my shadow for years. He had a quiet way of comforting me that no human ever seemed to match. When I heard about an old, isolated cabin in the North Cascades of Washington, I knew it was perfect. A place with no neighbors, no roads, just dense forests and the constant chatter of the river nearby. The cabin was nothing fancy. Built in the 1970s, it looked like it had been abandoned for years. The wood was weathered, gray from the sun and storms, and the tin roof had patches that looked like they had been hammered back together. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and dust. There were old sheets and blankets stacked in a corner, a rusted stove in the kitchen, and a small, narrow bed against the wall. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I brought my backpack, Max's food, a lantern, and plenty of bottled water. The first few days were peaceful. Max would wander the small clearing outside the cabin, sniffing at the pine needles and barking at squirrels, while I sat on the porch drinking coffee and watching the mist roll down the mountains. At night, the forest was alive in a way that was both beautiful and unsettling. The wind through the pines sounded like distant whispers, and the river gurgled nearby. Max slept at the foot of the bed, ears twitching at every sound. I told myself I was safe, but by the third night, something shifted. It started with small noises. At first, it was nothing unusual, branches snapping, the distant cry of an owl. But then I noticed it closer, right outside the cabin. Max growled low in his throat, something he rarely did. I assumed it was a deer or a raccoon, but his body was tense, hackles raised, ears pointed toward the door. The noises didn't stop. At first, I told myself it was the wind moving through the broken roof panels, or the loose boards creaking under their own weight. But then I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the dry pine needles, deliberate and heavy. Not far from the cabin, but close enough that Max's growl turned into a low, continuous rumble. I could see his whole body vibrating with alertness. I spent the night wide awake, every sense on edge. I kept the lantern close and the door locked, but I could hear it. The slow, cautious movement, circling the cabin, stopping, then moving again. The first night, I convinced myself it was a hiker or someone lost. But there was no flashlight, no call, nothing human except the sound of feet. By morning, the impression of a boot was pressed into the soft soil near the edge of the clearing. Whoever it was had walked around the cabin but had left before dawn. For the next 2 days, I avoided going outside except for the essentials. Max stayed close to me, his eyes scanning the forest. It was impossible to sleep during the day with the constant feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, and every distant sound made me jump. Then came the night that changed everything. I was reading by the lantern, Max curled up next to me, when I heard a loud crack at the back door. I froze. Max leaped to his feet, barking furiously. It wasn't the casual, playful bark he sometimes gave. It was urgent, warning, almost primal. I grabbed a heavy branch from beside the bed, my hands trembling. The back door had a simple latch, nothing sophisticated. Whoever or whatever was outside had tried to force it. Splinters of wood lay on the ground, and scratches marred the frame. I backed away slowly, keeping the branch in front of me, while Max growled and bared his teeth at the darkness beyond the doorway. I didn't dare call for help. There was no signal out here, not even a flicker of cell reception. I knew if this was a human, confrontation could be deadly. The cabin offered some protection, but not much. I stayed up all night, Max refusing to lie down, pacing in the small space. The sounds outside didn't stop. They came in bursts, like someone walking a circle around the cabin, stepping on sticks, brushing against bushes, then stopping just beyond the lantern's glow. Morning never came soon enough. When light finally bled through the gaps in the walls, I cautiously looked outside. The forest was empty, silent except for the river. I thought maybe they had left, but on the ground, Max sniffed at the dirt, then growled low again. Near the side of the cabin, I saw something that froze my blood. Footprints leading into the trees, too large for my boots, but unmistakably human. They weren't just wandering, they were deliberate, methodical, moving in a way that suggested someone had been watching for days. I realized I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, loading my supplies into my bag, making sure Max had his food and leash ready. I didn't care about leaving half the cabin behind. I just needed to get back to the road. I checked every corner, every window, every possible hiding place. The forest seemed to be holding its breath. When I stepped outside, Max at my side, I followed the narrow trail that led to the main logging road. My heart pounded with every snap of a twig. I felt eyes on me, always on me, but I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The sun was higher now, casting sharp shadows across the ground, and I kept moving faster and faster until the trees began to thin. Finally, I saw the road. A logging truck rumbled past, and I waved frantically, hoping the driver would understand I needed help. He stopped, and I climbed into the cab, panting, my clothes torn from the underbrush. Max jumped in after me, shaking and whining. I told the driver about the cabin, about the noises, about the footprints, but he just shook his head. "You're lucky you got out when you did," he said. "That area's known for trespassers, people who hide and watch. You're not the first to find them out here, and I doubt you'll be the last." It took hours to calm down. Max and I huddled in the cab, watching the forest recede behind us. I didn't sleep that night either, but I had escaped. The cabin, the trees, and the creeping terror that had lurked there felt like they were still embedded in my skin. I never returned. Years later, I drive past the logging road occasionally, and I think about that cabin. I think about the footprints, the heavy breathing I could feel in the dark, the way Max had known something was wrong long before I did. I keep my distance now, and I never travel into isolated areas without cell service. But Max, even now, sometimes freezes, ears pointed, growling at shadows I can't see. And I know he remembers too. The fear wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a ghost or a fairy tale. It was very real. Someone had been there, watching, waiting. And if I had stayed another night, I don't know what could have happened. All I know is that I got lucky. I got Max out and we survived. That cabin is still out there, silent, abandoned to the forest. And I am still careful because the memory of being watched doesn't fade. Not fully, not ever. I never thought I'd go back there, not after everything that happened. But after my ex-husband, Mark, passed away unexpectedly, I inherited the cabin he had in the woods outside of Red River, New Mexico. It was a small, weathered structure, tucked into a dip between two hills, surrounded by scraggly pines and dead brush. The kind of place people only went to when they needed to disappear for a while, or maybe when they wanted to hide something. The first time I drove up the winding dirt road since his funeral, the car groaned over rocks and potholes, throwing up clouds of dust that smelled faintly of sage and dry earth. The sun was dipping low in the sky, orange light spilling over the hills, casting long shadows that made the forest feel more like a cage than a sanctuary. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to touch anything Mark had touched, anything that carried a memory of him. But there was paperwork to handle and belongings to sort through. The cabin itself looked smaller than I remembered. The wood was gray and peeling, windows grimy, curtains torn in a couple of places. The porch sagged in the middle, and a few loose boards creaked under my weight as I stepped up. I unlocked the door with the key Mark had left in his will. Inside, the smell hit me immediately. Dust, mildew, and something faintly metallic, like old blood. My stomach churned. The main room was cramped. A small kitchenette with chipped linoleum, a sagging couch covered in a threadbare blanket, and a wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Mark had always been a pack rat, but I hadn't realized how much he hoarded. Boxes piled against the walls, some open and spilling over with old tools, paperwork, and random household items. I moved slowly, dragging a flashlight across the room. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I knew logically that I was. My heart thumped in my chest, and I kept telling myself to calm down, to breathe. In the corner, I found the bedroom. The bed was unmade, sheets yellowed with age. I lifted the blanket and froze. There was a stain, dark and crusted along the mattress. I gagged, covering my mouth, my stomach twisting. I had expected memories, maybe a little dust or mold, but not this. Not something that screamed of decay, neglect, and time that had been left unaccounted for. I backed out slowly, trying not to think about it, trying not to imagine what had caused it. I spent the next hour walking through the cabin, making mental notes of what could be salvaged and what should be thrown out. Most of it was junk. Most of it was evidence of a life I wanted to forget. But there was one corner of the cabin that gave me pause. The small study, tucked to the side of the main room with a single desk and a chair. Papers were scattered across the top, yellowed and brittle. Some of them were letters addressed to me from years ago, never sent. I didn't read them, couldn't. I had no intention of reopening old wounds, especially not here. I decided to stay the night. I wanted to leave, to drive back down the winding road and forget the place existed. But I had work to do tomorrow and no hotel for miles. I dragged a sleeping bag onto the couch, rolled it out and tried to settle in. The air was cold and damp, and the wind rattled the windows, making them shudder like fragile bones. I lay awake for hours, listening to the forest. Every branch snapping in the wind sounded like footsteps outside. Every gust of wind sounded like someone breathing in the dark. Around midnight, I finally heard it. A sharp knock at the door, quick and deliberate. I froze. My pulse shot up. The first thought in my mind was that someone had broken in, even though I knew the road was barely passable and no one knew I was here. Another knock, this time louder, sharper. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then I realized the sound wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the study. I wanted to convince myself it was the wind. I wanted to say it was a branch hitting the window, but the noise continued, soft, scratching, deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight, my hands shaking, and approached the study. The desk lamp flickered weakly as I turned it on. The papers on the desk had shifted. One corner was bent back, as if something heavy had been pressed against it. My stomach sank. I backed out of the room slowly, feeling my way along the walls. The wind outside rattled the windows again, louder this time, like it was mocking me. I tried to think rationally. The cabin had been empty for years. No one had been here. The noises were probably rodents or the house settling. But my instincts screamed otherwise. Something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, flashlight in hand, watching the shadows dance across the walls. I didn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like it was moving closer. By dawn, I was exhausted, my nerves raw. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed what I needed from the cabin and locked the door behind me. As I drove down the dirt road, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. The sun was rising now, painting the hills in gold. From a distance, it looked peaceful, almost inviting. But I knew better. I had felt the way the air inside pressed against you, heavy and watchful. I had heard the subtle, deliberate noises that didn't belong to the wind. I didn't know what exactly had been in the cabin with me, or for how long it had been waiting, but I didn't want to find out. Weeks later, I hired a local crew to clear out the cabin. They found signs of neglect, animal infestation, and a few personal items Mark had hoarded. Nothing explained what I had felt that night. Nothing explained the deliberate scratching I had heard from the study. The crew tried to reassure me that old cabins make strange noises, that my imagination had probably filled in the gaps. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin had been holding on to something. Something human, something deliberate, something that had no reason to be there but had been waiting for me. I sold the cabin a month after that. A young couple bought it, excited about the remote location and rustic charm. I warned them about the condition of the place, but I didn't tell them about the noises, about the oppressive feeling, about the way it had made me feel watched. I didn't want anyone else to experience that. Even now, sometimes when I'm driving down a quiet road or walking through a forested path, I think about that cabin. I can still feel the weight of the air inside, thick and suffocating. I can still hear the soft scratching that seems so purposeful. I don't know if it was some leftover of Mark's life, some twisted trick of my mind, or something else entirely. But I know this. I never went back, and I never will. Some places are better left alone, and some memories, no matter how close, are better left buried.